Given that the human brain is the most complex structure in the known universe, one must divide it into sections because the topic is just so enormous to attempt to study. This video is going to focus on how information from the general senses reach the cerebrum, how they're processed there, and then how motor commands would then go from the cerebrum to, say, skeletal muscle. So that's the topic of this video, which is obviously part of a series. There are many other videos which talk about other aspects of brain function. So here there is a receptor. It is a tactile corpuscle in the skin, and the other senses in the skin, they're part of another lecture. And so these neurons are perceiving something about the external environment. When something touches us, there are pain receptors, there are temperatures for heat and cold, for pressure, for itch, for tickle, for vibration. We detect a number of chemicals. Now, this type of receptor is not located in one part of the body. There are receptors that work like that. Our receptors for vision are only located in our eyes. Our receptors for taste only in our mouth, or pharynx included. Those for smell only in our nose. Those for hearing only in our ears. So there are what are called special senses whose stimuli are detected only in specific parts of the body, like the eyes, the ears, the nose, the mouth, etc. And as we will see later, these senses are processed in a specific area of the brain that's reserved only for, say, vision. So vision is processed here and only vision. Hearing is processed here and only hearing. Those are the special senses, but that's not the focus of this lecture. This lecture is going into what are called the general senses. If I ask a class, name the one part of your body that you feel pain from, or touch, or tickle, everyone pauses for a second and then realizes it's not an accurate question. We don't feel these senses from just one part of our body. We feel them all over the place. So we don't have a specialized heat area or a specialized tickle area or a specialized pain area. These are felt all over the place, unlike vision, where we do have a specialized vision area. And as we'll see, all of these general senses are then going to go to the same region of the brain, unlike vision, which has its own region, and olfaction, which has its own region, etc. So these general senses include things like touch, pain, temperature. How do they reach the brain? Well, it is a little complicated. So for example, if we consider touch neurons here, you can see that if something touches the foot, a sensory neuron detects touch, and it then is going to then carry that message towards the central nervous system. But this is actually a very long neuron because it will actually, one single neuron, travel up the leg to reach the spinal cord. But then actually it does not stop there. It will then go all the way up the spinal cord to the medulla oblongata in the brain. So this is what we call the first order neuron. The first order neuron is the neuron which is going to detect the stimulus. And actually you can see how long it is. It's actually stretching most of the length of the body. This is one cell going from the area where we were touched up the spinal cord to where it synapses with a second order neuron. I'd like to, in this video, just kind of go through all of these, but then we'll go to the spinal cord and the midbrain where we can see some of these particularly. So here it's synapses, and then there is a second order neuron, which will then start in the medulla oblongata and then progress through a tract known as the medial lemniscus to where it then will reach the thalamus. And so This second order neuron actually does something interesting as well. It will actually cross over to the opposite side of the body so that the touch information from, say, the left leg is now going on the right half of the brain, because this orange second order neuron crosses to the other lateral side. Now, pain and temperature are a little bit different. And so if something touches this foot, which hurts the foot, then the pain, this will be detected by neurons which detect either pain or temperature, and they will then travel up the leg and reach the spinal cord. But this is where they stop. They synapse here with a second order neuron. And so notice that the first order neuron for pain and temperature is not as long as that of touch and will not travel through the spinal cord. The second order neuron crosses to the opposite side of the body so that the information about pain or temperature from, say, the left foot is now going to be traveling up the right half of the spinal cord and reach the right half of the brain. So in both of these tracks, these orange second order neurons, they crossed to the opposite side of the body. This will go up a different region of the spinal cord, the spinothalamic tract. So while both the pain and temperature and the touch information are traveling up the spinal cord, the first order neurons for touch are going through the posterior column. The second order neurons for pain and temperature are traveling through the spinothalamic tract. So both of those second order neurons cross to the opposite side of the body, and then both reach the thalamus, where a third order neuron is going to project to one region of the cerebrum known as the somatosensory cortex. It is the somatosensory cortex which will then process the sensory information from the general senses, what we refer to as the somatosensory information. And so if you were to look at the cerebrum, we would have what's known as the central sulcus here, which splits the frontal lobe from the parietal lobe. And then anterior to this central sulcus, we have the precentral gyrus, and this is where the motor cortex, which we'll be discussing presently, is found. And then posterior to this central sulcus is the postcentral gyrus, gyrus meaning fold and sulcus meaning groove between the folds. Here in this postcentral gyrus, this is where the somatosensory cortex is located. Let me step back and then just quickly review a couple of points. So the spinal cord is organized. If you recall, the soma of neurons are located in the central gray matter here in this H or butterfly-shaped region. Meanwhile, the axons, the tracks carrying information, are located in the white matter. Now, there are both descending tracks coming down from the brain, which will be discussed presently, and then sensory tracks, which then are going towards the central nervous system. So they are they're going towards the brain, they are ascending. And once again, there is an organization here. So it's not as if, you know, the white matter is just this chaotic mass of axons, nor are all of the ascending tracks unorganized. And so there are distinct regions for touch. So if you recall, it is this region of white matter here, the posterior column, where the information for touch is located. Now, not only is this organization that touch is traveling separate from other general senses, but also, as you can see here, there is an organization in where the touch came from. there is a tract known as the fasciculus gracilis carrying touch information from the hip and leg. There is a tract known as the fasciculus cuneatus carrying touch information from the shoulder and arm. These, once again, will synapse in the medulla, because once again, these are the first order neurons. They are traveling up the spinal cord and will then synapse in what's called the nucleus gracilis and the nucleus cuneatus in the medulla before traveling onwards. Also, there are other types of general senses. There is proprioception, giving our body a sense of where our body parts are. This will then travel up through the spinocerebellar tracts. But more relevant to this topic, there are spinothalamic tracts which are carrying pain and temperature information. And so these sensory neurons then are the first order neurons for touch, but the second order neurons for pain and temperature. Just a reminder that sensory neurons are these unipolar neurons where the soma is in the middle of the nerve cell, and therefore its soma is actually located just outside the spinal cord in what is known as the dorsal root ganglion. So the sensory neuron is coming from the periphery where touch was perceived or pain or temperature was perceived. The soma is here in this swelling along the dorsal root, the dorsal root ganglion. Now, for touch, the sensory neuron will then continue up the posterior column until it gets to the nucleus and not synapse there. But for pain and temperature, then the sensory neuron, the first order neuron, then synapses here, and then there is a second order neuron which will then carry the message further. The second order neurons, somewhere along their length, cross over to the opposite side of the body. So ultimately, the right half of the brain is perceiving touch, pain, and temperature on the left side of the body. This crossing over occurs in the brainstem for touch, because remember that the first order neurons go up to the brainstem, to the medulla, and that's where the crossing over occurs. But here for pain and temperature, the crossing over will occur in the spinal cord. And so we have these ascending tracts, the posterior column and the spinothalamic tracts reaching the brain. Once again, the first order neurons will synapse in the medulla, where then the second order neurons will then carry the message further. There are lots of nuclei in this in the brainstem, which can then process this information, because one of the things that's happening in both the thalamus, as we will see, but then also in the brainstem, is the sorting out of information to decide on what to focus our attention. By the time we reach the midbrain, oh, there we are. By the time we reach the midbrain, there are fiber tracts, once again, carrying this information through the medial lemniscus. That is where the touch information is traveling after synapsing in the medulla. And then here you can see the spinothalamic tracts. So here are axons which are carrying the messages further through the midbrain. And then from here, the information reaches the thalamus. The thalamus, as I discussed elsewhere, has a great deal of gray matter, which is organized into nuclei. And so if we're looking at the lateral view, here you can see the ventral posterolateral nucleus. And this is where the medial lemniscus carrying touch information and the spinothalamic tracts carrying information about pain and temperature, these tracts have brought this material through, this information through the brainstem. This then reaches the this nucleus of the thalamus, and then neurons here project to that somatosensory cortex of the parietal lobe. And so the general sense information inputs into this area of the thalamus, which then sends outputs to the somatosensory cortex. This allows for the general senses to be made aware of. We're aware of touch and pain and temperature. And if we had any lesions, say here in the thalamus, that would cause loss of feelings of pain or temperature from the limbs and trunk. The information from the face, touching of the face, does not travel up through the spinal cord. Then cranial nerves bring this directly into the brainstem. And if this was the posterolateral nucleus, then nearby, kind of more medial to it, so I had to remove that in order to see it, we see the posteromedial nucleus, which is going to bring in the general senses from the face. So if something touches my face, if something hurts my face, or I feel a warm temperature, here won't be a spinal nerve bringing this information. It'll say be the trigeminal nerve carrying information about touch from the face. This then goes into a different nucleus of the thalamus before being projected to the somatosensory cortex. Now, one of the things that has happened in the thalamus and then also in the brainstem coming to this point is that attention has been focused. So if, we think of it, I often ask my students, everyone feel your left shoe. Everyone feel your left shoe. Okay. Feel the chair behind you. And then you can feel the temperature of the room, and then we could add in other senses like the sound of the air, etc. We have this enormous sensory register. At any moment, we're feeling lots of touch. You're feeling the touch of your clothes at your knee, at your back, at your elbow. You're feeling your shoes. You're feeling the ground. You're feeling the chair. You're hearing the air. You're seeing sights. All of this, we can't focus on it all at once. It's too much. So we have to select which of this sensory register is the most important. What deserves our attention? So hopefully when you're in class, you're listening to your teacher and you're not paying attention to your left shoe or the chair or the smell of the air, etc. And so it's not just a simple relaying of sensory information up this pathway, but also things are happening along this length, such as decisions are being made of what's important. So an analogy that I give is if, and I'll just speak of where I work. If you think of, the job of the secretary. Now, it may be that, if a big decision is made, that was a department chair or that was the president of the college, and you say, oh, the president of the college made this decision, the chair made this decision. But lots of decisions are made. So out of all of the problems that arise in a day, say the secretary or the administrative assistant, they get lots of them and they deal with them. All right. Just because these problems never made it to the president's desk or the department chair's desk doesn't mean that they didn't need to be solved, that they weren't important, or that they weren't dealt with. So along this route and in the thalamus, it's not as if, there's no modification of the messages. And so the decisions are being made, what's important enough to warrant, the attention being focused on it. And then also, if something isn't going to enter our voluntary awareness or conscious awareness, that doesn't mean that problems weren't dealt with. So the brainstem and the thalamus, they do stuff. It's just not stuff that we're consciously aware of. But that doesn't, mean that, they're just simply passing information along. And so By this point, then the information from the general senses reaches this area of the cerebrum, as I had pointed out, known as the somatosensory cortex. Because everything was kept in order, all right, so you recall that there was, a fasciculus gracilis, a fasciculus cuneatus, separating, touch from the hand versus touch from the foot, etc., because everything is still kept in order and projected that way. Remember that, touch from the face is going into a different part of the thalamus than touch from the limbs and trunk. When it's projected to the somatosensory cortex, there is a map of the body. And so we have, once again, that central sulcus and the gyrus, the fold, which is behind the central sulcus, the post-central gyrus. This is the somatosensory cortex, which gets the information from the general senses. Not vision, which goes over here, not hearing, which goes over here. They're special senses. But touch, temperature, itch, etc., they are all then traveling to the this same region. So the general senses are general in two ways. They are perceived all over the body, and they all go to the same part of the brain. Because everything was kept in order, this now forms more or less a map of the parts of the body. And so if there's electrical activity here, ding, 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 I know, that's on the map of my body. Something is touching my hand, but actually not this hand. All right, because remember the second order neurons cross the opposite sides of the body. So it would be my left hand, which is perceived in the right half of my brain. And so there is a hand area, there is a foot area in the somatosensory cortex. So your brain knows what part of your body was touched based on where the electrical activity is here. So there is a map of our body. If we consider this map, it looks a little odd, right? Because, this is what's referred to as the homunculus. If we were to ask, what does the map of the body look like? If you were to try to draw your body as it appears on this map of your body, your face would be huge, your hands would be huge, your back would be small. And your first thought might be, if this is a map of my body, it's a lousy map of my body. My body does not look like this. And that may be true, but the goal of this map was not to, to represent physical space accurately. There are certain parts of your body where touch is more important. We are very sensitive to things touching our fingertips. We're very sensitive to things touching our face. And that's just because of how we need the sense of touch in, as we manipulate objects. And so where we have a greater sense of touch, where we have more receptors, that area has a greater representation on the somatosensory cortex. One of the exercises you can do in lab is you can have a lab partner and you can give them one color marker and you have another, and you close your eyes and they say touch your fingertip, all right, and then touch an area of your arm with their marker. And then with your eyes closed, you take your other color marker and then try to pinpoint exactly where your lab partner touched you. You'll probably come really close on your fingertip. You probably won't come as close on your ventral arm. If you were to use your back, you'd probably be farther still. Why? Well, look here. Our fingertips have a huge representation. Here, our back does not. The larger the area dedicated to a body part on the somatosensory cortex, the more precisely you can locate a stimulus there. So when you look at your fingertip, you'll probably realize, wow, I came really close to where my lab partner touched me. I have great precision in locating stimuli on my fingertips, not so much on my arm. And that's because in your somatosensory cortex, you have a far greater area dedicated to your fingertips than you do to your arm or your back, etc. And so now you are consciously aware of being touched, or the temperature or pain changes in your foot or whatever. And so in general, we are not at all consciously aware of things going on in our brainstem, a little bit in our diencephalon. So maybe you could get like a dull ache that's hard to localize from there. But when we say, something is touching my arm, I'm consciously aware of that. That is because now it has reached the somatosensory cortex of the cerebrum. That is so. This first part of this topic is how could sensory information get then to the brain. And now I'd like to talk about, all right, well now how would a motor command then go from the brain? In class, what I like to do is I like to begin the class. I say, all right, this is important. We can't go forward until you do this. Everyone turn and hit someone next to you. Obviously a lot of people feel sheepish, not always. Sometimes someone just goes off and hits their lab partner. But at some point, the question comes up. All right, someone hits you, so what do? Well, you hit them back. All right, and so how would you do that? How would you decide to then hit them back? Well, remember that here we have this post-central gyrus behind or posterior to that central sulcus. But then there's another gyrus in front of that. That is the pre-central gyrus in the frontal lobe of the cerebrum. And this is where we have a motor map of the body. Right, so just like there was an area for this is where I feel the face, this is where I feel the foot, etc. The same thing applies here. We have neurons which are dedicated to the face. We have neurons which are dedicated to the back and the arm, and neurons which are dedicated to the legs there. Now, on the somatosensory cortex, if there was electrical activity, ding, ding, ding right there, you would say, aha, something is touching my hand, something is touching my knee, something is touching my cheek. But here, if you have electrical activity here on the hand area, you're doing this. All right, you're not feeling your hand, you're moving your hand. You're moving your cheek, you're moving your leg, etc. So we have two maps of our body, one on the somatosensory cortex and anterior to that, one on the motor cortex. So once again, this organization is key. Your brain, which has never seen your arms or legs, right? Your brain is in a bony box. But because of this organization, neurons stay in order. Your brain say, something is touching my foot, even though you've never, the brain has never seen the foot. Or I'm going to move my foot now. How? Because there's a foot area, there's a hand area. And electrical activity in the hand area moves the hand. Electrical activity in the forearm area moves the forearm, etc. And so we have another map of the body on the motor cortex here. Now, how does that reach the leg? Because obviously, if you're going to have your leg move, the message has to go from the cerebral cortex, where your voluntary command started, and reach leg muscles. And so there is a corticospinal tract. Now, if you recall, not only were there ascending tracts in the spinal cord, but then there were descending tracts as well. So the white matter of the spinal cord has axons, and then these axons, some then carry information from the central nervous system. They're going down. Once again, they're organized. They're separate from the ascending tracts. But here you can see the corticospinal tract. There's an anterior and a lateral tract. And this is carrying voluntary commands to muscles. We'll get to involuntary commands in just a second. And so neurons have their soma in the motor cortex, and then they travel through, then the brainstem, we'll get back to that in a second. They go down the spinal cord through these corticospinal tracts. If you just listen to the name, you know it's a descending tract. Corticospinal means it starts in the cortex, goes down to the spinal cord. Just as spinothalamic told you in its name, it was an ascending tract going from the spinal cord to the thalamus. Now, as the lecture on the spinal cord reviewed, then from the synapse there, because the corticospinal tract will end in one of those ventral horns of the spinal cord. And from the ventral horn, now you have the soma of a motor neuron, and then the axon will then leave the spinal cord, very often forming a plexus where the ventral roots are sorted out before you would say get the radial nerve, which would go to the posterior arm and the triceps brachii, where it could cause the arm to move. So the corticospinal tract will synapse with the soma of a soma of a motor neuron. So motor neurons, their soma are in the ventral horns of the spinal cord here. And then these motor neurons, they then, I'm sorry, that's an interneuron. Here we come, the motor neuron. There's the motor neuron with its soma in the ventral horn. It then leaves through the ventral root of the spinal cord and then can go out to a muscle. So the corticospinal neuron sends a message here, all right, and then this can send a message out to the muscle. Now, once again, just as the brainstem, oh, I'm sorry, let me do the thalamus first. Just as if we consider that map of our body on the somatosensory cortex, it's not accurate in a physical distance sense, you would get the same sense from the motor cortex. Once again, if you were to look at what your body looks like as your brain sees it, your face is huge, your lips are huge, your fingertips are huge. But this then isn't correlating with physical movement, but rather the precision of, or the amount of movement we can do, but rather the precision of movement. So if we look at your fingertips, you can do very precise movements there. If you think of your, the muscle movements which change facial expression, or vocal cords, or move the eye, they're capable of very precise movements. Your back, not so much. All right. If you recall lectures of motor units, when a nerve cell touches muscle cells, in your eye, your vocal cords, one nerve cell might touch 1 or 2 or 3 or 5 muscle cells. The motor unit is really small. In your back, it may be hundreds. One neuron tells hundreds of muscles to contract. So you don't have a great precision of movement. It's either 0 muscles contract or hundreds, nothing in between. Whereas here in the eye, you could have just 1 or 2 cells contract. And so therefore, certain parts of our body have more motor units there, more motor neurons going there. And on our motor cortex, this map then has greater representation. So our face, our lips, etc., seem bigger. Now, I can decide to voluntarily turn my neck, as you can see here. But if someone were to slam a door, it's also then possible to have a reflex where I could jerk my neck around. And that's because there are a lot of parts of the brain involved in motor function. So the motor cortex would be where voluntary motor commands are generated. When I decide, hey, I'm going to move my arm, that came from here, all right? And the motor neurons of the corticospinal tract, they will cross to the opposite side of the body in the medulla. All right, and so just as the brain feels the opposite side of the body, so that the stimuli here are coming from this arm, the decisions to move the arm hit the opposite side as well. So here you can see in the midbrain, we have the cortical spinal tract on this prominent peduncle of the midbrain. And you can see that the fibers are still kept in order, you know, the head, the arm, the leg, etc. These corticospinal tracts will continue as the pyramids on the ventral surface of the medulla, these triangular ridges. And where the pyramids disappear, that's where the corticospinal tracts are crossing then to the opposite side of the body. It's what's called the decussation of these tracts. So that is how the voluntary commands are given. But there are other areas which are involved in involuntary commands. So if you look inside the cerebrum, most of the gray matter is on the cerebral cortex. But you do have areas like this, right? See, this is gray matter of the cerebrum, but it's not in the cerebral cortex. It's deep inside the cerebrum. These are what are known as the basal ganglia, deep inside the nucleus, or cerebrum, such as the globus pallidus, the putamen, the claustrum, the caudate nucleus, etc. And so there are nuclei which are not the motor cortex in the cerebrum, which are involved in the commands which are not voluntary. The corticospinal tract coming from the motor cortex, this is voluntary. And because it travels through those pyramids in the medulla, it's called the pyramidal system. The pyramidal system is giving this voluntary control over skeletal muscle. But then there are these other areas as well. So if you were to look deep inside the cerebrum, if you were to look inside the medulla, the cerebellum, the diencephalon, here we have a number of nuclei which can contribute to involuntary action. So if I jerk my head around like that as a reflex, that was not voluntary. If I decide to take a step, all right, so that step that I take, that was voluntary. But if I'm going to gossip about what happened in lab to my lab partner, then somehow I continue walking. And so the rhythm of walking starts this cycle that I'm not consciously thinking about. I'm not saying take a step, take a step, take a step. So in addition to the pyramidal system, starting in the motor cortex, traveling through the corticospinal tracts, which travel through the pyramids of the medulla, there is then also an extrapyramidal system, which involves nuclei deep inside the cerebrum, the cerebellum, the brain stem, also in the thalamus. So these are involuntary areas which contribute to the extrapyramidal system. So our motor control is not just voluntary commands to skeletal muscle. The pyramidal system, also these extrapyramidal messages through starting in nuclei other than the cerebral cortex, deep inside the cerebrum, the diencephalon, the brainstem or cerebellum. So just to demonstrate this here in the medulla, the corticospinal tract travels through this region of the medulla on the ventral surface, and it forms these triangular bulges that one can observe. So they're called the pyramids for their triangular shape. And the pyramids disappear here, and that's where their fibers are crossing. That's known as the decussation of the corticospinal tract. Then in addition to the corticospinal tracts, which is the voluntary information, there are a number of other tracts from the extrapyramidal system. So for example, the reticular formation, which gives a lot of involuntary commands, then is the source of the reticulospinal tracts. The red nucleus is the source of the rubrospinal tract. And so in addition to voluntary commands traveling through the pyramidal system, involuntary commands can travel through other tracts, such as the reticulospinal tract here. Finally, I have described the cerebellum elsewhere, but just because we're talking about motor commands, when the pyramidal system says, start a muscle movement, like, so take a step using these muscles, or, put on the brakes using these muscles, very often the pyramidal system is going to use too many neurons and would then have what's known as an overshoot, where too many muscles would be used. So the cerebellum then has a number of jobs in modifying the decisions of the motor cortex. So the cerebellum is the second largest part of the brain. I review its anatomy elsewhere. Its main function is that it is measuring the position of body parts. If you recall, those proprioceptors, they end in the cerebellum. And as a result, it has a sense of where the body's position is, whether we're on balance, and it knows what muscles then are appropriate. And so when the motor cortex plans a motion, then the cerebellum can guide it, correct it, so that only the correct number of muscles are used, so that we remain on balance. The cerebellum and other areas, such as the premotor cortex, can help to memorize muscle patterns so that we know what muscles will be used next. So if you're planning an action, knowing, after I move my arm this way, what muscle movement comes next allows for a smooth, fluid movement. So here's once again those proprioceptors coming up through the spinocerebellar tracts. And so the cerebellum knows when we're on balance or not, because if we're off balance, the muscles which we would move next would then be different. So just as there are maps of the body in the cerebrum, there are maps of the body in the cerebellum as well. There is a single map in the anterior lobe, and then there are two maps of the body in the posterior lobe of the cerebellum. In all of these maps, our trunk and head are kind of midline in the lobe, while the limbs are going more laterally from that. And so the cerebellum is going to help guide muscle movements, as do so many of those nuclei in the thalamus, in the midbrain, the substantia nigra, etc. And so the brain is quite complex, and we have lots of different regions of the brain. We're consciously aware of what occurs in the cerebrum, but just because we're not consciously aware, say, of the substantia nigra of the midbrain, or the red nucleus of the midbrain, doesn't mean that they aren't functioning. And so these have roles in, so here's a substantia nigra there, in involuntary muscle commands. There are a number of nuclei in the brainstem, which would then be the nuclei of cranial nerves. So say facial muscles, their commands would obviously not go from the spinal cord, but rather from these brainstem. And so this was kind of an overview of all of the diverse pathways, both for the perception of sensory, of somatosensory information, but then also of motor commands.